Hello again from Metro Manila, Philippines. Exactly 78 years ago, on November the 30th, 1939, began the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland. It lasted 105 days, so from November the 30th, 1939 to March the 13th, 1940. Despite decisively winning the war and annexing over 10% of Finland's pre-war territory, mostly in the Karelian Isthmus and Ladoga, Karelia, the Soviet Union failed in its key objective of conquering the entire Finland. It had already established a puppet government of Finnish communist immigrants, led by Prime Minister Otto Ville Kuusinen, the so-called Terijoki government, because the government during its brief nominal existence was based in the Karelian Isthmus city of Terijoki or Zelenogorsk. However, by the end of January 1940, it became clear that the Soviet Union would not be able to conquer Finland, and therefore the Terijoki government was quietly disbanded. The Soviet Union began through its ambassador, Ms. Alexandra Kollontai, in Stockholm, Sweden, to negotiate with Finland, and the Finnish-Soviet border became almost the same as it is today. The only notable exceptions being that the Hankoniemi Peninsula, in the southernmost point of the Finnish mainland, was given to the Soviet Union as a naval base, but Finland was allowed to retain the Petsamo or Petsenga area, which gave it access to an ice-free port on the Arctic Ocean. Today, the Hankoniemi Peninsula belongs to Finland, while the Petsenga area belongs to Russia. The Winter War had been preceded by diplomatic activity. There had been 3 or 4 rounds of negotiations between October and early November 1939 in Moscow. The small Finnish delegation had been led by the Councillor of State and outgoing ambassador to Sweden, Mr. Juho Kusti Paasikivi, while the Soviet negotiating team basically included only the Soviet communist dictator, Mr. Joseph or Joseph Stalin, and his close assistant, Mr. Vyacheslav Molotov, who was serving as the Soviet foreign minister. At issue was the so-called security of Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was then called. The Finnish-Soviet border at the time passed only some 30 or 32 kilometers to the northwest of Leningrad. The Soviet leading politicians were arguing that this was a too close gap in case another great power, such as Germany, invaded the Soviet Union through the Finnish territory. The Soviet leaders did not believe Finland's assurances that it would defend its territory. And already in his several meetings, secret meetings with some Finnish political leaders, most notably the Finnish Prime Minister, Professor Aimo Kajander, and the Finnish Foreign Minister at the time, Dr. Rudolf Holsti, between April and September or October 1938. A Soviet diplomat, Mr. Boris Yartsev, whose real last name was Rybkin, had declared that the Red Army, meaning the Soviet army, would not wait on the Rajajoki or border river, which was the river along which much of the Finnish-Soviet border passed at the time, but would instead invade Finland from the southeast to defend the Soviet territory in case Germany invaded Finland. So in order to officially guarantee or solidify Leningrad's security, the Soviet political leaders proposed that the border be moved to the middle of the Karelian Isthmus. The Karelian Isthmus is a narrow piece of land between the Gulf of Finland in the west, the Gulf of Finland being the eastern arm of the Baltic Sea, and Lake Ladoga in the east. So the distance between the Finnish-Soviet border and Leningrad would grow from about 30 kilometers to about 70 kilometers. Besides, ostensibly to make sure that it would be a peaceful border, but actually to improve its chances of invading more of the Finnish interior, and especially the old city of Viipuri or Viborg. The Soviet political leaders demanded that all fortifications be destroyed along the new border. It also demanded Finland to concede its outer islands in the eastern Gulf of Finland. Suursaari, literally translated big island, but in Russian Gogland or Hogland. Then Lavansaari, Sides Island or something like that, although it could also be translated more figuratively as Typhus Island. Then both daughter islands, Tytärsaaret and Seiskari. At some point during the negotiations, the Soviet dictator Mr. Stalin was willing to trade the city of Hanko and its neighborhood for one of the western Gulf of Finland's outer islands, such as Jussarö or Ryssarö. Finland would receive as a compensation an area twice as large as the area to be surrendered to the Soviet Union on the Karelian Isthmus, in the districts of Repola and Porajärvi in eastern Karelia. Finland had occupied those two towns from 1918 until the last months of 1920 or the first months of 1921, when, in accordance with the peace treaty of Tartu in Estonia, they had to be ceded to Soviet Russia. The small Finnish delegation's leader, Mr. Paasikivi, was willing to make more concessions than most Finnish political leaders, most notably the Finnish president, Mr. Kyösti Kallio, and the Finnish foreign minister, Mr. Elias Erkko. But even he was not willing to move the new border as far away from Leningrad as the Soviets demanded. And even he was unwilling to give up the Hanko area to the Soviet Union. The leader of the Finnish Defense Council, War Marshal Gustav Mannerheim, basically agreed with State Councillor Paasikivi on the possible trade-off of territory. The negotiations broke down on November the 9th. The small Finnish delegation returned by train to Helsinki on November the 15th. And then until November the 26th, there was basically calm before the storm. However, not on one front. Already during the negotiations, the Soviet state-controlled media, radio and newspapers had launched a virulent anti-Finnish campaign, mocking Finnish political leaders and basically claiming that the Finnish working class was being horribly persecuted by the factory owners and owners of large farms and so forth. The Terijoki government's declaration issued on December the 1st, 1939 echoed this propaganda and claimed that the Soviet army would come to Finland to liberate the Finnish workers and peasants from the cruel and unjust tyranny of the Finnish factory owners and large landowners. The border regions, or many of the border regions, inhabitants had been evacuated, especially in the Karelian Isthmus, to some extent in Ladoga, Karelia. Thousands of people had voluntarily evacuated such major Finnish cities as the capital, Helsinki. However, by late November, some evacuees had actually returned to their homes near the border because they believed the Finnish political leadership's assurances that Finland would not face a winter war against the Soviet Union, but rather the Soviet Union would test the Finns' nerves by propaganda until the following spring. But then came Sunday, November the 26th, 1939. And during the morning of that day, there was a blizzard, a huge snowstorm on the Karelian Isthmus. Around noon Finnish time, the weather gradually began to clear, and already by 2 p.m. Finnish time, the weather was clear enough for the Finnish border guards to see through binoculars well inside the Soviet territory. Between about 2:30 and 3 p.m. Finnish time, or between 3:30 and 4 p.m. Soviet Western time, those Finnish border guards noted some or several shots, cannon shots and similar ones fired inside the Soviet territory. Shortly before those shots had been fired, they had noticed a Soviet officer riding hard and quickly on his horse to some Soviet soldiers who were stationed in the Soviet village of Mainila near the Finnish-Soviet border. The Soviet officer had said something to those Soviet soldiers who had quickly left their bases, and after that the shots had been fired. The Finnish border guards clearly had also noticed how some or several shell holes had appeared on an open treeless field some 800 meters inside the Soviet territory. Interestingly, one Finnish military pilot who was then serving in the Soviet army noted that around 3 p.m. Finnish time on November the 26th, 1939, from the so-called Kirjasalo, or literally translated bookwood or book forest wedge that thrust towards Finland but was inside the Soviet territory, one cannon had fired, having its pipe at an angle of about 360 degrees to Mainila. And Kirjasalo was situated to the north or perhaps northeast of Mainila. In the rural territory of forests and fields, the Finnish-Soviet border made curves, so it wasn't straight, and so from Mainila it would have appeared that those shots had been fired from Finland because they were fired over Finnish territory. At night, one intelligence officer or similar soldier phoned the Finnish Army's headquarters telling of this incident. And then later on November the 27th, the Soviet government accused the Finnish army of having made this unprovoked incident, of having fired with one or more cannons inside the Soviet territory, resulting supposedly in the death of one Soviet officer and 3 lower-ranking Soviet soldiers, and in the wounding of 9 Soviet soldiers. The incident was investigated by Finland, and on November the 28th, the Finnish government sent a diplomatic note by way of response to the Soviet government, telling that Finland could not have even accidentally fired inside the Soviet territory because the Finnish artillery had been withdrawn so far away from the Finnish-Soviet border that even accidentally these incidents could not take place from the Finnish side of the border. The Soviet government rejected this explanation, claiming that the Finnish army continued to attack the Soviet territory, not just on the Karelian Isthmus, but also in other border areas, and unilaterally revoked the Finnish-Soviet non-aggression or non-invasion treaty that had been made in 1932 and which still technically was valid. In response, Finland still asked that the incident be investigated by a committee involving both Finns and Soviets, and that both the Finnish and Soviet armies be withdrawn a certain distance from the borderline to prevent similar incidents from happening. The Soviet government rejected these overtures and broke off diplomatic relations with Finland on November the 29th. According to Marshal Mannerheim's memoirs, already on November the 29th, Finnish border guards in the far northern city of Petsamo were attacked, and in any case, the Soviet artillery stationed in the southern part of the Karelian Isthmus fired their opening volleys of shells at 6:50 a.m. Finnish time on the morning of November the 30th. Later that day, the Soviet army or armies began to roll across the Finnish territory. Already on the first day, some 79 Finns, both soldiers and civilians, were killed, largely in bombings. Several cities such as Viipuri and Helsinki were bombed. Within 1 week, the Finnish army had retreated to its main defense line that was known later as the Mannerheim line, after Mannerheim, who had become, at the start of the Winter War, the Finnish army's commander-in-chief, because the Finnish president, Mr. Kyösti Kallio, had decided to give the commandership-in-chief to him. The Finnish constitution declares that the Finnish president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but that he or she can yield that position to someone else, at least in case of war, or especially in case of war. During the rest of December, there were attacks and counterattacks, but the Soviet army failed to decisively defeat the Finnish army, despite being clearly larger than the Finnish army. During December, also, volunteers gradually started to arrive from other countries. Sweden provided the largest contingent with over 8,000 volunteer soldiers. According to the official figures, some 12,000 foreign volunteers managed to arrive to Finland during the Winter War. Not all of them were sent to the front line, however, because not all of them were judged to be able to defend Finland in a real combat. Over 50 foreign volunteers died during the Winter War. Finland received a lot of diplomatic goodwill from the other Western countries. However, no country officially committed itself to defend Finland militarily, not even Sweden. The Swedish Foreign Minister, Mr. Rickard Sandler, resigned in protest at his government's decision to remain officially neutral in the Finnish-Soviet War in December 1939. Sweden and various other countries did send a lot of material aid to Finland, however. So, to put a long story short, in January 1939, in January 1940, the front in the Karelian Isthmus was basically stationary. In Ladoga, Karelia, in the eastern to northeastern Finnish province of Kainuu, and then, of course, in Lapland, the front was somewhat more mobile. Basically, the entire Petsamo area had already been abandoned to the Soviets in the first weeks of the war, but the Soviets had failed to advance in any significant way westward or southwestward from the Petsamo area after having conquered it. Then on February the 1st, 1940, the Soviets launched a general offensive or grand offensive on the Karelian Isthmus, resulting in a breach, a small but important, crucial breach of the front line on or around February the 11th, 1940, in the town or village of Summa on the Karelian Isthmus. After that, the Finns gradually had to retreat to the middle front line on the Karelian Isthmus, and then by the end of February to the back front line, one of whose points was the city of Viipuri. In Ladoga, Karelia, and elsewhere on the front, the Finns actually held their own fairly well, but on the Karelian Isthmus they were clearly in retreat because they were simply running out of soldiers, ammunition, and other equipment. The Soviets simply had too many soldiers, too many bullets, too many airplanes and cannons and so forth to be held back anymore. And to put a long story short, Finland then sent in early March 1940 a peace delegation to the Soviet Union, whose most prominent members were the Finnish Prime Minister, Mr. Risto Ryti, who at the time was also serving as the governor of the Bank of Finland, although of course he was on leave because of his prime ministerial duties, and then by State Councillor Paasikivi, who had become a minister without portfolio, but actually that cabinet minister who would be responsible for leading peace negotiations. The terms were harsh. Finland had to give up quite much territory especially in Ladoga, Karelia, that still remained in Finnish hands at the end of the war. To some extent, territory even in the northernmost part of the Karelian Isthmus. And then Finland had to give up the entire Hankuniemi Peninsula. It also had to surrender much of the Salla area and part of the Kuusamo area, northeastern Finland, and had to surrender a portion of the entire Fishers Eyot or Fishers Island on the Petsamo coast. However, due to diplomatic pressure from Britain and Canada, the rest of the Petsenga or Petsamo area was returned to Finland. It included, after all, British-Canadian nickel mine. So Finland had between 250,000 and 340,000 soldiers, only 32 tanks, most of which were First World War tanks and not really suited to combat. Over half of them were modern British Vickers tanks, but in the only combat, or slightly over half of them, tank combat in February 1940, where they were used, about half of them were either disabled or destroyed or conquered by the Soviets. Only 114 airplanes. Whereas the Soviet Union had between 426,000 and 761,000 soldiers, 1,500 or more armored cars, overall 998,000 soldiers, but all of them were not stationed at the front on the same time. Tanks between about 2,500 and 6,500, and then over 3,800 aircraft. Some 26,000 Finnish soldiers were killed or went missing, compared to about 127,000 to 168,000 dead or missing Soviet soldiers. Some 44,000 Finns were wounded, compared to about 189,000 wounded, concussed, or burned Soviets. Between 800 and 1,100 Finns were captured, compared to over 5,500 Soviets. Over 950 Finnish civilians were killed in air raids. Some 20 to 30 Finnish tanks were destroyed, compared to between 1,200 and over 3,500 Soviet tanks. 62 Finnish aircraft were lost, compared to between about 260 and over 510 Soviet aircrafts. The Finnish total casualties numbered about 70,000, compared to between 321,000 and 363,000 Soviets. Aside from God's grace and the so-called spirit of winter war, near unanimous decision to defend Finland against the Soviet invasion, Finland benefited from the so-called Motti tactics, where small pockets of the Soviet invaders were cut off from the rest and gradually then forced to surrender, or killed, or then some of them managed to break out of the encirclement, especially in the Battle of Raateroad in Suomussalmi, northern to or eastern to northeastern Finland. The Finns inflicted major casualties on the Soviets. And then during the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938, Joseph Stalin had ordered the execution of over 30,000, execution or imprisonment of over 30,000 officers of the Soviet army, including such military heroes as General Tukhachevsky, with the result that by 1939, the Soviet Red Army had many inexperienced senior and mid-level officers. They were politically loyal, but they were not strategically so intelligent as many of those who had been either executed or imprisoned. The Soviets originally, or at least their political leaders originally, expected the Finnish army to capitulate in a matter of weeks. And it was a great negative surprise to them that the Finnish army, despite its major losses, was able to resist them for 3.5 months. Also, what probably persuaded the Soviet dictator Stalin to accept the peace terms was the fact that Britain and France considered sending a contingent of men. Originally, they promised to send over 50,000 men, but by the time the peace negotiations started between Finland and the Soviet Union, this had dwindled to between 20,000 and 24,000 men. Still, even the promise of such help probably persuaded Stalin to conclude peace, because Stalin did not want to go into war against Britain and France. Maybe he already foresaw that he would need those countries' help in eventually fighting against Nazi Germany and its allies. Nothing came of the British-French expeditionary forces coming to help Finland during the Winter War, because Finland's Scandinavian neighbors, Norway and Sweden, refused to allow the British and French troops to pass through its territory. They were fearing probably Soviet and even German reprisals and attacks as a result. So overall, Finland received a lot of goodwill. Many people, including the British Navy Minister or First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who would then become Prime Minister in May 1940, praised Finland's heroic efforts. The League of Nations, which was the United Nations predecessor, dismissed the Soviet Union from its membership and asked its remaining members to undertake sanctions against the Soviet Union. And generally speaking, the image of Finns as heroic people fighting against a superior enemy was greatly enhanced in the world. In the United States, former President Herbert Hoover, who was a warm friend of Finland, organized relief efforts to help Finland. And some hundreds of American and Canadian Finnish men managed to arrive to Finland before the end of the Winter War, and some of them actually fought on the Finnish side right on the last day of the war. The so-called truce or interim peace of 15 months followed. It was an uneasy time when the Soviet Union applied diplomatic and even economic pressure on Finland and encouraged pro-Soviet groups in Finland, such as the communists, and even sent some spies to Finland. The most outrageous breach of this peace was the shooting down of a Finnish passenger airplane, Kaleva, on the Estonian coast on June the 14th, 1940, incidentally just 2 days before the Soviet Union officially occupied or started to occupy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the 3 Baltic republics that are situated to the south of Finland. And this was apparently an overreaction by 2 Soviet military airplanes, because if they were so hard posed to get the diplomatic mail, which a few French, German passengers and the 1 American passenger of the airplane were carrying, they should simply have had to send some soldiers to the Tallinna Ülemiste airport, where they could easily have confiscated the mail before the airplane had taken off. And since Germany was the only foreign country that officially was willing to help Finland in a new war against the Soviet Union, Finland then decided to go to war again in late June 1941 in an informal military alliance, or so-called brotherhood in arms, with Germany against the Soviet Union to get back its eastern territories, and then quite many Finns were also willing to conquer or to see some other territories conquered, but that is another story.